I believe I heard that Elon Musk was watching Vikrant Aggarwal talk about 3D printing a car while everyone else was watching his rockets land. But I don't know. That's just an apocryphal story that I've heard.
But another piece of science fiction.
Another piece of science fiction. It is, but he will need local motors microfactories on Mars when he gets people up there, because we need to have resilient supply chains, and there's no place that needs to be more resilient than an extraterrestrial outpost that's trying to make work happen. So we are in an amazing time of change and disruption. And you can either be scared by it or you can embrace it and move along. Certainly at Local Motors, we're embracing it. And that makes it, very exciting to be part of.
Hi, M4 Edge listeners. Thanks for being curious. Our episode today is about the future of... I left that last part blank because you can decide for yourself. We interview Jay Rogers and Vikrant Aggarwal, who are respectively the CEO, co-founder, and the president of Local Motors. I could tell you that Local Motors is an automotive manufacturing company, but that would be criminally uninformative. Local Motors makes vehicles that are unusual and makes them in an unusual way. Their marquee product, Ollie, is a fully autonomous electric vehicle shuttle bus. Their manufacturing process relies on direct digital manufacturing, DDM, hybrid additive and subtractive manufacturing, and is designed around microfactories, hence the local in Local Motors. This conversation is about the future of mobility, manufacturing, work, supply chain, energy. You decide. And on what other podcast can you get a CEO talking about Nobel-winning Harry Markowitz, Oprah, and the Wolverine movies, all in one conversation? Before we get into it, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to some recent reviewers on Apple Podcast. Roundpeg, Jason W305, JBL2744, and my favorite, Starstuck Time Traveling and Lost. Thanks to you all. And all you other listeners who haven't yet rated the show, help us out, would you? It only takes a minute, and it really helps. We'll mention your name, and from now on, we'll also read our favorite review, so make it a good one. Okay, let's get to Local Motors. Enjoy the episode. Jay Rogers and Vikrant Aggarwal of Local Motors, welcome to M4 Edge.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning to you and Marco.
Good morning, Vikrant. Good morning, Jay. It's great to have you on our show, and Jay, it's great to talk to you again. So let me kick it off with our usual warm-up question, which distinguishes our show for its politeness and approachability. The first ice-breaking question is, why on earth are you doing this? You guys are trying to disrupt both mobility and manufacturing with just one business venture. Tell us a bit what got you into this and what is driving you.
Maybe I'll kick off the answer. We really felt as if there was a need for new technology in vehicles quickly, a little bit before we had the big surge in autonomous vehicle and driver assistance, but certainly around the time where electrification and other connected items were happening in vehicles. And so we felt that the pace of vehicles was just too slow in terms of their development. So in looking into it, and this was starting back in 2004, we felt there needed to be a different way to conceive of the development of vehicles and to get them to market quickly. And that really was the beginning of trying to determine a new process for making vehicles. And those two things, therefore, became linked. The ability to be able to design and develop a vehicle through what we call direct digital manufacturing, and then the ability to onboard what we would consider more of an open network of technology providers. And that has come to pass in a way where open source software and now open hardware standards have begun to truly bring on interoperability. And so the two parts, the process and the product, really reinforce each other. And it's been a journey since 2004. Vikrant, your thoughts?
Yeah. So Jay, thank you. I've not been on the long journey that Jay has been on. I wish I was. I had the pleasure of being on that journey with him. But I've been on this journey for the last year or so, and I think the unique thing that Local Motors brings, as Jay said, is the process and the product. And one of the key elements of many that I think we also bring is, our ability to scale microfactories with the processes Jay talked about, right, in local environments, right? As we all know, jobs are important. They've always been important and will continue to be important, right? That's one element. The second is the kinds of jobs that we bring. So that's on the product side. On the process side. On the product side, if you put aside some of the recent challenges, which I think are opportunities as well, from an EV perspective, my fundamental belief, having worked in kind of an IC engine business for over 20 years, is that this is where we have come, and this is where we're going to accelerate, right, from a product perspective. So I feel quite bullish about where we will go with the next future.
So it's rare for me and Marco to have two guests on at once, and your company is unusual in several respects as well. So why don't we step back for a minute? And first, I'd like Jay, if you could describe really what Local Motors is and does. We haven't yet fully explained that to our guests. And then Vikrant, if you could talk a little bit about the different roles that you and Jay have, and where, how you share responsibility, where you divide responsibility, just so our viewers, our listeners, I should say, get a sense of how the two of you operate and what the company does. So Jay, if you go first, what is Local Motors really?
Local Motors, in a nutshell, is a platform for future mobility development right now. And the reason why we call it that way is a lot of times people think the future is pie in the sky, something they'll see in the future. But right now, the world has sped up in large part for the last 20 years due to rapid information transfer through the internet, and hardware has lagged. And so Local Motors is an embodiment in the vehicle area of trying to move that forward, the hardware side of it, much faster. And so we think of it more as a platform for vehicle development. And our lead product right now is an autonomous electric shuttle that works right now on closed campuses, and it's called Olli, O-L-L-I. And so Local Motors will make many other kinds of vehicles, and Olli right now is on the forefront of both low-speed electric vehicle transport and also in a what we'd call level 4, level 5 autonomous vehicle mode. So, and as we discussed a little bit before, the way in which Local Motors does its business is through direct digital manufacturing. So in designing and developing Olli and in producing Olli, it starts at the core with a 3D printed file. And we have pioneered the large-scale hybrid manufacturing of systems. And we call it hybrid because it's both additive and subtractive in assembly. And that's part of this, the core part of this platform is we design digitally, we make digitally, and we even go through the material science to understand how to recycle our vehicles when they're made. So that's all part of that platform that is Local Motors.
Vikrant, I mean, so many follow-up questions from there, but Vikrant, if you can take us first through a little bit of how your management structure works, what are the things that you do that Jay doesn't do? You said you were making ICE, so internal combustion engines earlier. Tell us a little bit about the background that brought you to Local Motors.
Yeah, so I worked for a big heavy-duty engine manufacturer, right? And I worked with them for over 20 years. And then last year, I was approached by Local Motors to come and work for them. And truly, if I look back, I wish I'd been here years earlier. Okay, like I said earlier, I think if I look at Jay's role and my role, I look at our roles in kind of Venn diagrams, right? He's, let's say, Venn diagram A, I'm B. He's the visionary. He pushes our thought process in terms of how do we think about mobility as a solution and what features and capabilities do we need to develop, not only in Olli, but in mobility broadly, okay? And then my role primarily is I am responsible for operating the company, so as to speak, right? Where we take take what we have developed and take it to the marketplace, go work with the end users to make sure we meet the needs. And then there is a little bit of an A intersection B, right? Where Jay and I clearly, he pushes me, I push on him. So at the end of the day, the vision and the reality, what he is thinking, also we take to the market in the most expeditious and customer-focused perspective, right? Not that he doesn't have that or I don't have what he has, but I think it works really because he's thinking, in my mind, 5 to 10 years out. I'm thinking, 1 to 5 years out, right? And not that he can't think 1 to 5 years out. I probably can't think 5 to 10 years out, but he's good at that. So I think that is the combination. And the key element also we spend time on is, how do we go convince the marketplace? How do we go convince PTOs, as an example, or public transit organizations, or how do we convince hospitals, right, to shift the whole concept of mobility, right? So that's kind of the broader elements. So he's got the strategic element, I would say, and the product element. I've got more of the operating element for the company.
Vikrant's very deferential in sharing in that way, and I just want to note that that's part of the reason why we've been able to work so well together, and I hope I will always do the same. His expertise, I just want to note, in building and running systems coming from, he calls it the internal combustion engine world. It's a world that the world needs to understand and respect more from a point of view of these are highly engineered and complex systems with deep supply chains. And actually coming from there and understanding as much of what we're not doing as what we are doing is deeply helpful. And so his knowledge and work on operations and focus on that time frame, which often seems like an eon, even 1 year out, is critical for us. And, I felt, over a year ago that it was important to bring on, more people that I could learn from. And Vikrant has certainly been that. And I think that I've watched other CEOs who have either failed or succeeded on the ability to bring in people who can really help to teach them things they don't know and to collaborate. So that's, from my perspective, a lot of where our roles have born from.
When you say focus on things that you're not doing, do you mean that Vikrant, you are finding gaps in sort of operations that LM had that you're fixing or improving, or do you mean more? Jay, did you mean more things that the traditional auto manufacturing sector is doing that you're intentionally moving away from? What did you mean, things that you're not doing? I
meant the latter. So
okay.
There are just things that you don't want to repeat because they're not part of your process.
Yep.
When your supply chain is much, much smaller or your path to development is faster, you need to think through things differently.
Gotcha.
That's what I meant.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect.
And Jay, you mentioned that the approach you have at Local Motors is a hybrid approach. So you emphasize the importance of digital manufacturing. You explained that you produce using both 3D printing, but also subtractive manufacturing and assembly. I have a couple of questions for you on this. One is, the last time you and I spoke, you pointed out that you thought digital manufacturing has now moved beyond the hype phase, and it's moved into what you were defining, I think, as the plane of enlightenment. And I think it was a very interesting concept. It's something that I would love you to expand on for our listeners. And connected to this, the issue of 3D printing, the additive manufacturing aspect. You guys were amongst the pioneers of 3D printing at this scale and at this level of intensity of utilization. So I was curious also on your perspectives here, both Jay and Vikrant, on how important is 3D printing in enabling the greater flexibility, the efficient production at lower scale, the microfactories that Vikrant was mentioning at the beginning. But Jay, maybe we can start with your view on the digital manufacturing moving beyond the hype cycle.
Sure. I'll start on that and then maybe the hybrid aspect of things and let Vikrant talk about sort of the nimbleness of our process. The hype cycle, I think, starts really, 3D printing was born 30 years ago or more. And it started with some of the technologies we see today. I think selective laser sintering was first, and then later came fused deposition modeling, or now known as fused filament. And we've seen many kinds of stereolithography and other things like that come along, and the material science has come along with it. But that has really been a focus on additive, whereas today we use a process that's very much hybrid because it is additive mixed with subtractive, mixed with assembly. And so we think of additive as one very important tool in the kit bag, but it's not the only one. And so again, I think that, the hybrid nature of what we do is something we focus on. And the hype cycle aspect of it is really understanding materials characterization and understanding your machining process and your additive process and your assembly process is the only way to move a product forward that isn't hype. We see a lot of small scale printing, which the trade space or the marketing wants you to believe, voila, I have a file and now I have a part that can fly. You hear things like buy to fly ratios in aviation and other items like that, but pesky things like standards, ISO standards and other things stand in the way, and they should, because we need to fly with veritable parts, and that could be fly on the ground, fly in the air, fly to school, if you will. And so this is really the key thing, is getting the material science, getting your process down. You could think about it in the old way of thinking of statistical process control, where you're not inspecting every single part that comes off the line, but rather you have a process that you inspect, and you know that your parts are within spec because the process is within spec. These are all things that I think have gotten us off of the hype cycle and onto the path or the plane of enlightenment, because we really do make shuttles through this hybrid process and are putting them in customers' hands.
Sure, Jay. That I'll just follow on Mark and Michael. I think from nimbleness, let me just step back. I think there are two broad elements, at least the way I look at what direct digital manufacturing is doing and will do. I think as we evolve and grow, the number one is we talk about having a product out there that's environmentally friendly, and DDM or direct digital manufacturing actually is a process. And I think there are many companies out there that have products that are environmentally safe, but the processes are still the same. Not saying that they're not making improvements. DDM actually does both, right? It allows you to have processes that require less space, less capex, less energy consumption, and so on and so forth to produce a product, right? In our case, which is environmentally sustainable. Okay, that's one. The second is from a nimbleness perspective, the ability to one is make changes to the product, right? Can be done much more quickly, rapidly, and cost effectively. Second is the ability to go start assembly of those processes, or 3D printing in this case, is much quicker. So I think the nimbleness comes both from a design evolution, but also from the ability to start up DDM in different parts of the world as we move forward.
So how are the benefits of the nimbleness? How are the benefits of the quicker design recalibration or whatever? How do they show up in your bottom line? Is it cheaper for you to manufacture your EV bus, right? So Ollie is a shared autonomous electric vehicle. It's a SAVE. So is it cheaper for you to manufacture that than another EV shuttle or EV bus? Do you use fewer, labor hours or FTEs? What are the sort of bottom line advantages?
I mean, I think the two I can think on top of my head, and I'll ask Jay to chime in as well. If you look at the number of parts that are required to assemble a vehicle, we have a 90% reduction in parts, right? So it's a simpler supply chain. It's a smaller supply chain, right? That's one. The second element is around, the ability to evolve the product, right? I think as a society, there is this expectation that the product is technologically evolving as time goes by, right? That's another element. And third is, how do you use 3D printing or direct digital manufacturing to do things? For instance, if we make, like Jay said, currently our product is OLE. In the future, we may do other things, the ability to switch from one to the other, right, is much more quicker, nimble, and cheaper. So I think those are the three broad elements. Jay, I'll toss it over to you and see if you want to add anything or if you have a different point of view.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I would add that we get this question a lot because of, I mean, I think this is probably why Michael Porter has been lionized for his thoughts on strategic competitive advantage. He's pointed out very well that there's sort of two areas where a company can hold strategic competitive advantage, either be differentiated or be a low-cost manufacturer. So you asked a pointed question, Michael, is it cheaper? And Vikrant has answered the fact that actually by reducing the supply chain, there's an opportunity, if you were making a product that was on an apples-to-apples basis, to make it in a simpler way. The bill of materials or direct materials in low volume may be more expensive since you're not buying in bulk the way a mass manufacturer were, but the number of parts you buy and therefore your nimbleness is much lower. The number's lower and the nimbleness is much higher. So that can bring your costs down and offset some of those direct material costs. And that's all on the cost side. But on the differentiated side, from the sort of Porter side of things, is really more about what we can do. We're sitting here talking about autonomous vehicles, and the world around us in the trade talk, the trade space is saying, well, autonomous vehicles are still several years out. There are lots of people talking about them, but in the automotive world, they are saying, we'll work on driver assistance right now because, full autonomy is still a couple of years out. We saw this with EV. When Tesla came along and Nissan, the world was saying EV is way out. Today, you can't drive many roads in developed countries without seeing a lot of electric vehicles going by. And Tesla is now one of the most highly valued corporations in the automotive world because of bringing out an electric line of electric cars. So just like the advancement of EV really starting 7 years ago, we think it's time for autonomy to come along quickly. The future is here. The future is now. And so that's a differentiated value proposition, which means that it allows us to, let's say, bring a better product and probably, charge more, if you will, or take more value out of other things that are going on, other forms of mobility as a service. And so I think of it more as a dual competitive advantage. We offer both a differentiated product and a lower cost product that may not last forever, but I think the differentiated part is what's more enduring, and the low cost part will come and go depending upon which products we can bring in that are cheaper to make.
If we can stay for a moment on how you organize the production. I mean, you've made a very, very strong and clear case as to how this digital manufacturing approach allows you both to reduce costs through simplification, but also to have more differentiation, more nimbleness in switching lines of products. I wanted to talk a little bit about the human capital aspect of it. Vikrant, you mentioned the importance of local jobs. This is something that Jay has also emphasized in the past. And I've noted, if I look at the videos of your production line, one thing that has always impressed me is that when I watch the standard video footage from a traditional car plant, all you see is robots. And when I watch your videos, by comparison, the human presence is quite strong. And so I was curious as to your thoughts on this, the importance of the human capital in the process and the importance of the skills and jobs that you're creating.
Sure. So, Marco, this is a really important question. It's maybe the most important. If you think about a robotic future, you have people like Singularity University talking about, have we reached the singularity? And Ray Kurzweil and other folks like that, predict, when a machine can beat a man at chess, you're edging up on the singularity. And I think what we have seen here is that that is more like a hard deterministic view of the future where robots decide what robots are going to do and humans are unnecessary at that point. I personally don't believe in a hard deterministic future. I think that there may be pockets or elements of things where computers can tell computers what to do. But in our world right now, though we build vehicles digitally, we've seen less of a need for robots to keep the line nimble rather than more. We have a core robot in the middle of the production process and at the end of the process. The hybrid machines that we use to make the body in white, if you will, or the 3D printed structure is a robot. And the vehicle we're making is a robot. But in between, the nimbleness of the parallel processing of the human brain is really necessary. And I know Vikrant sees this and feels it also in the same way. I'd love to hear his thoughts on it. That we employ people who don't have to have robotic degrees, but they do have to be open-minded in terms of thinking about things in a different way. And so it's wonderful to see high school grads that don't have a college degree learning a new trade. And also can be people who are retired who come back into work learning a new trade. So I think it's being young in mind, and it's especially important today in the world of the unrest that we have going on. A lot of it, in my opinion, comes down to a sense of fear and a lack of opportunity. And I love getting into local communities and having the opportunity for these microfactories to offer dignified jobs where people can say, I 3D print vehicles and put them together. That is a motivating thing for all of our team to talk about. And so that's really kind of my feeling. And Vikrant mentioned earlier on, distributing manufacturing around the world is one of the things that we, intend to do. And as the product grows, so does the network. And so that means that those kinds of jobs can go everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, if I may just add, I think just maybe reinforce what Jay said. I think about this, Marco, in two broad elements. One is, to have flexibility and agility, in my mind, Vikrant's mind, you need less automation, right? You can have extreme automation and achieve those two things, but that becomes cost prohibitive. So, if you look at the whole premise that we have around flexibility and agility, that's how we get it, along with skill sets, Marco and Michael, that hopefully we are creating and utilizing that can come from any backgrounds. The second element is, and I think this has been further discussed in the last few months with the health crisis that we've gone through, is if you look at traditional industrial manufacturing or automotive manufacturing, you get economies of scale and scope, right? You open huge plants, and you need to maximize volume in those plants. So you don't actually go out and create employment, Marco, as an example, in Italy or in France or in India or in China, right? Whereas our model, both from a DDM perspective and microfactory perspective, is creating human capital opportunities that I think, Vikrant's opinion, traditionally would be difficult to create.
So you've both mentioned microfactories a little bit. Describe these. So are they, how many do you envision having? How many do you have now? How many Ollies or other vehicles would a microfactory be able to put out in here? What's the capacity? How many people work at these? How many large scale 3D printers are on site? What are these things?
Well, so I'll take it quickly. So a microfactory is really, as it describes that, it's interesting in the word, as you think about it, it's very simple. It means small factory. And it was not something that I came up with as a word. This was something that was done it was theorized by two professors, Wells and Nieuwenhuis, out of INSEAD and Cardiff University. And the thought was, when you can digitally manufacture, mass manufacturing loses its competitive advantage, and because you don't gain the mass competitive advantage, and so you have what's more an economy of scope instead of an economy of scale. And so that was where the theory started. For us, a microfactory is pretty simple. At a minimum, on one shift, we want to be able to make 250 vehicles. These are high content vehicles, and so 250 vehicles means that you're making something that is in the neighborhood of $300,000 a unit for sale price. So you can do the big pencil math. That is really a $60 million top line revenue shift, if you will, from a microfactory. And so that's a big business for a small factory. And when you really know what the size is, we're talking about 50,000 square feet under roof, something around 6,000 to 7,000 square meters, and something that's pretty low capital to put up. You can run them for many years. They have core hybrid machinery for additive, subtractive, and assembly on the inside. And basically, the intent here is to have a return on capital that pays back that machinery and factory over the course of just a couple of years. And so that's pretty nimble. It means that you can get them up. 50,000 square feet is sort of the size of a small store, if you will. It's not the size of a super Target or other things like that. I mean, those are usually 200,000 square feet. So it's kind of a quarter of a Target, if you will. Nowhere near the size of an IKEA or a Bass Pro Shops or something like that. So it's a small box, if you will, and it doesn't have effluents. So it's not the kind of thing where you need a river and, environmental waivers to be able to pollute the earth. It is much more energy efficient. It's about 40% more energy efficient than a standard car manufacturing facility, and that's been verified by our national labs in the Department of Energy. And so it is a small box that can produce on one shift 250 vehicles, which makes a nice top line and a good profit margin.
That's pretty remarkable. And those micro factories, I guess this is edging into the next section, which we really want to talk about supply chains and COVID. But do those micro factories each manage their own supply chains? Are the materials for the 3D printing all coming from one place, or are they each sourced separately? Are the batteries coming from one manufacturer? Are they each sourced separately? How does that work?
So to me, Michael, I think there is an element of standardization of raw materials that come in, right? So they would and they will source a set of components from the local supply chain, because our whole objective is to, localize as much as possible. Having said that, there are elements that we would source locally if possible, right? But to some supply standards or specifications, if I may choose. Okay, so that's the whole thought we have in terms of localized supply chain to standards that are standard specifications, if I may say.
Hi there, Michael here. If you're a startup or a large business, I bet that many of your decisions are frozen. COVID-19 has not only kept us confined at home, but has paralyzed planning because there's so much uncertainty about the economic climate and the business environment. Of course, this uncertainty is deep, and our sense of it is magnified by our fears. But in truth, businesses always operate with uncertainty. One of the specialties that Marco and I have developed over the years is combining data-driven economic analysis with robust scenario analysis. If your business is frozen in place right now because the uncertainty is daunting, please contact us. We'd love to work with you, help you cut through the noise, understand the uncertainties, and help you develop strategies that are robust to multiple scenarios. Send us an email at strategygarage@m4edge.com. That's strategygarage, one word, at m4edge.com. And we'll start a conversation quickly to help you start moving. And hey, stay safe.
Yeah, I wanted to stay now on the issue of supply chains. Vikrant, you've mentioned the recent health crisis. The last time Jay and I spoke was actually just in the very early stages of the COVID crisis. And now we have seen globally major disruptions to global supply chains, as well as a big challenge to all corporations, to all factories, on to how they organize work on the factory floors. So I was very curious to hear from the two of you, what has been your perspective, your experience so far on both counts? One, is it easier to reorganize work safely in a microfactory? And two, given the way you're organized, and we haven't talked about it, but your operations are actually global. You have various operations around the world. What has been your experience in terms of the supply chain disruption in general and the way you have handled it?
Yeah, so I think, to me, Marco, fundamentally, let me just step back and just talk about supply chain. I talked about our objective and goal is to have localized supply chain, right? So fundamentally, as a result of that, we have seen very minimal supply chain disruptions. Okay, because you're not moving, as you and Michael know, product from one end of the world to the other end of the world, right? So that's been one. The second is to your question around reorganizing work, so as to speak, so that you can do it in a safe and responsible fashion. My view is that since our microfactories are smaller and have lesser number of people, the ability to organize work, even both exit and entry into the facilities, in terms of keeping safe distance, in terms of following processes and protocol, becomes easier. And it has, and I don't want to compare it to a big plant, because I think it'll be an apples to oranges comparison. But my fundamental view is that, just to summarize, the supply chain disruptions have been minimal, if at all. And second is our ability to organize around, some basic protocols, right, has been easier because just of the magnitude of the operations we have, or the size of the operations we have.
Well, Vikrant, I know you said it was apples and oranges to compare to a large scale ICE manufacturer, but I'm wondering actually if there's something about you talked a lot about nimbleness at the beginning of this conversation. Is there something about the way you are set up that allowed you to react more nimbly than would a large conventional automobile manufacturer?
Michael, absolutely. I mean, here you're trying to manage, let's say, an organization of 20 to 40 people in a microfactory versus 10,000 in a plant, right? That pumps out vehicles, right? So the ability to communicate, the ability to, for lack of a better term, enforce, train, educate, right, is much easier, right, and much more effective. If I'm trying to tell two of my kids, right, what I expect of them, even though I fail miserably every day, right, it's easier than going to their class and telling school class size in the multiples of tens what's expected of them, right? So I think it's again, just using that analogy, I believe it has been easier, and it is easier.
Got it. And Jake, sorry to have cut you off before. What were you going to add?
No, not at all. I think that I wanted to speak about this question of supply chains, because this isn't a disagreement point with Vikrant, but it is something where it's a concern in my mind. And it's the following. I feel as if the United States is entering into a Cold War trade policy with China. It seems that way. We've seen through tariffs and other items like that. And it's not hard for anyone in the world to understand what a disruption of a supply chain with China means to their shopping habits at Walmart and Fry's and other places like Best Buy. We've seen how the tariff wars have caused short-term disruptions, and it's anybody's guess as to whether that will be long-term beneficial or long-term harm to the average consumer. But my concern is more when you think about the interdependencies of globalization, the CEOs and marketers and salespeople that I respect the most have been unequivocally clear that globalization is a positive trend, meaning it has given markets, huge market opportunities for companies all over the world. And, Markowitz is alive and well in thinking of his theory of comparative advantage, and it allows people to access better markets, globalization, that is. And I think the best marketers and salesmen and business people want to see globalization continue. Unfortunately, the trade wars that we have make that very difficult. And so while we may have experienced low supply chain disruptions, I think that the fact of the matter is, as a competitive advantage, being local and developing local supply chains is a business competitive advantage. And we are not lucky, as Oprah likes to say. Don't believe in luck, but opportunity meeting preparation. We have prepared. And this opportunity now in a global freeze or trade war means that local resilient supply chains should be the winner. But there is one caveat, and that is that the other adage, I hate to speak in so many adages, but it sometimes helps. Close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, is a joke we used to tell in the Marines. And I think that close doesn't really cut it in resilient supply chains, meaning if you have a small number of parts, but one of them comes from overseas, you are close, but you can't deliver your end product. So if you're going to do this right in vehicles, really resilient supply chain means really localizing. And that takes serious thought, because a vehicle minus one important part like a battery is not a finished vehicle. So we have work to do on resilient supply chains, and we are prepared for this opportunity and continue to work at it.
Before I let Marco follow up, I just need to point out that this is definitely the first interview where someone's quoted both Michael Porter and Oprah at once, so that's cool. So, and while you were talking about global supply chain, Vikrant temporarily moved and showed his background, which was a map of the world, which was also perfect timing.
That was not by design. I was running out of power on the computer.
So, all right, you made a bunch of really deep points there, Jay. So, and I know that Marco's got a champion at the bit to follow on. So, go ahead, Marco.
No, so I actually give Jay the opportunity to expand a bit on this, because I completely agree with you that the risk of the US in particular and the world in general moving towards a more confrontational approach to trade policy and globalization, I think it's a real one. And I completely agree with you that this will have costs and disruptions that we are not fully appreciating right now. And I wanted to connect this to something that you, Jay, have stressed in the past, which is the importance for businesses to be not only prepared for specific eventuality, like in this case, further increase in protectionism, but also to develop the quality of anti-fragility. So really to be able not just to be resilient and withstand shocks, but to actually grow stronger as you are hit by shocks. So do you want to talk a little bit about this exactly in the context of the disruptions we're seeing, Jay, probably not just to global supply chains and trade, but also we're seeing such an economic shock that will imply potential disruption to financing flows, to consumer behavior, to government policies. How do you see the importance of business strategy in this context?
I mean, you have referenced things we talked about before. Nassim Taleb's book, Anti-Fragile, was one of his series that included probably the more well-known Black Swan. And I think it is massively important as a lesson. He calls out in the book the concept of a word, anti-fragile, that he points out doesn't really exist. Fragile exists, but the opposite of fragile is not strong. He says, it's sort of a triad. Strong is something that is like a battleship, very heavy, very expensive. Once it gets going, if it has an intended target that fits with its weapon system, it'll destroy it. But if there's something like a small boat laden with explosives, it's very vulnerable to that and can't reconfigure. And so this concept of strong is a battleship. The concept of anti-fragile is something that is resilient. And Taleb points out in the book that the best example we can point to is something like the medical version of hormesis, where you give somebody a live virus in small doses so their body begins to build up immunity to it, much like a vaccine or a dead virus even, that allows you to build up antibodies. And so he points to hormesis as an example of anti-fragile in the world. And here we are in the middle of a global crisis started by a virus. It would be wonderful if there was some form of hormesis for society and for business. I've thought a lot about it. I don't know that there is. I think we are in an example of a very rigid, strong set of structures where our corporations and our nations are built on strength, not on resilience. And so here we are as a small little boat in this, we being, Vikrant and I and this team at Local Motors is a small little boat in the global shocks, but we have built a more resilient company. And I think you hear around the halls of Local Motors all the time that our ability to survive has a lot to do with our culture, but it also has a lot to do with the way in which we designed a local, resilient supply chain business. That doesn't mean we don't get our butt kicked on a daily basis, because we are still stuck in a very big, strong set of rigid rules. Regulation is one of those. We can't just wipe away regulation in developed countries, but we're working with regulators to try to bring our version of hormesis or nimbleness to the forefront. So I think Taleb, when I read the book, I had no idea how valuable it would be to thinking about the world gripped by a COVID crisis or by civil unrest. But if there were ever a type of company that would be possible to be, anti-fragile, I think that's what we built.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, to me, it's not a synonym, but flexibility and nimbleness are close cousins. And you mentioned early in this conversation the difference between economy of scale and economy of scope. Most of the largest top line revenue companies around were built on economy of scale. And so that implies a built-in rigidity that's just hard to unwind. And so when there's a shock to the system, you're stuck with that scale. And I think we're seeing that right now. I want to go back a little bit to the supply chain discussion. And Vikrant, you mentioned earlier that at a raw materials level, you've got some common sourcing. And so I'd like to understand actually how deep your typical supply chain goes. How many intermediate steps before it gets into a micro factory? How many countries are involved before it gets into a local local production facility? What does that supply chain actually look like?
Well, I mean, I think fundamentally, we are sourcing materials for our product from Europe primarily and from the US. Okay. And there's one element, the hub motors, they come from China. Okay. That's fundamentally, how we are sourcing. The key element is the polymers that we use for direct digital manufacturing, which comes from a plant in the US, but it's also a company that's headquartered in Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Okay. And we use them as the key ingredient, polymer ingredient for the 3D printing capability. The rest of the stuff is either coming, we use the autonomous kit, and the hardware associated with that. That's, again, a couple of global organizations, right? But other stuff is fundamentally all localized.
And the part that you said was China sourced, did you have trouble, at least at the beginning of the pandemic, in securing those components, or was it not an issue for you?
We did not. I mean, there was a little bit of touch and go, Michael, but we did not. We were not adversely affected. Having said that, I think, like everybody, we took actions to make sure employees were safe, right? So we did, temporarily suspend operations, right, in a microfactory, right? That, I think, gave everybody some time to breathe, and then deplete the supply chain, right, in one way or the other. But I think if there was not a global pandemic, it was a regional pandemic, my suspicion is that we would have seen some disruption from a place like China. And I think it probably gets more challenging given the trade war discussion that Jay and Marco and you were having earlier, right? So I think that would have happened, but we didn't see much of that in the last few months.
I was just going to add also, from a history, it's maybe not well known that when we started talking about small internal permanent magnet motors, I have been told that it started with General Motors needing small motors to do electric windows in cars. And they had a lot of technology in this. At that time, it was a new feature, and they had a lot of technology around the creation of IPMs, or internal permanent magnets. It was said that in order to be able to grow this business, that processing of these rare earth magnets was given to groups in China in order to trade off for guaranteed supply for a period of time. Today, it's now well known that most of the rare earth, neodymium, the dysprosium, and the other things that make up internal permanent magnets, which are so important to electric motors, is now owned and run out of mines in China. And the mines like Mountain Pass and other ones in the United States have long been shut down. We lose an institutional memory about how to make these things. And I'm going to cut an edge here. It's, I guess, appropriate for an M4 Edge podcast. I'm going to cut an edge, and that is
nice.
that is to say that we can't do that ever again. I think that the lesson should be burned in our skull that if you lose core manufacturing capabilities, and Vikrant's brought up a great example, the hub motors that we buy started as a British company, was bought by a Chinese manufacturer and moved over to China. And that's not to be scared of. It just means that there is high precision casting. There are laminates, precision laminates that go into it. These are wonky manufacturing things to talk about, but every country, United States included, should be wary about losing core manufacturing capabilities because as a population, not having the ability for people to imagine the trades. And this is something that Germany has done very well, which I don't think we have done very well, but Singapore has done very well, but we have not done very well in the United States, is a dignity in trade or trades, if you will. And so I think that we would do well to remember that just like mining rare earths or creating internal permanent magnets and the like is a skill where you need dignity in the trades. And I don't know that we think our kids, I know I have 4 boys, Vikrant has a couple of children, they will not do college and learning in the same way. They already don't. They tell us more at our kitchen tables, every night about things they've learned on the internet, not just things they've learned at school. And so we need to bring dignity back to the trades. And I'm very hopeful that end product manufacturers like Local Motors can do that.
I couldn't agree more, and this is an extremely, extremely important point, both for the future of skills, the future of the economic future of the country, and the future of jobs. As we get ready to wrap up our conversation, I wanted to bring it back to the issue of the future of autonomous mobility. And Jay, you pointed out that only your current product is level 4, level 5 autonomous vehicles, and now is deployed in reasonably controlled environment. Tell us a bit more how you see the future of mobility evolving, the future of autonomous vehicles, and in particular, how much of it depends on the evolution of technology and how much of it depends on the way in which we organize the mobility in our countries.
Well, I'll answer this quickly. I know Vikrant, being very close to the market too, will have his own thoughts on it. For me, it is really about the tech is there. The tech is there, especially as you think about low speed. Being able to remove a steward, if you think about an elevator, it's an apt analogy. There were people who will remember there used to be an operator on each elevator in every building around the world that would say going up, going down, and when you'd get to a floor, they would adjust a little bit to make sure it was at the right height, and then you could get on and get off. And the idea of riding an elevator today with somebody on it is just downright weird. And I think that is very true to this mechanical device of a vehicle. We have the processing power at low speed, and we have the capabilities to be able to do it. We do not have the regulatory dispensation, and we need to do a lot of education of the public, just like happened with elevators, for people to gain, and now also with autopilots in planes. You don't get to look up front when a plane is landing in 0 feet visibility, but it happens because of the evolution of great technology like millimeter wave radar. So the tech is way much more there than people think, but the regulation is very far behind, and low speed is what makes it possible. Vikrant, I'd give you the last word on this product for sure.
Yeah, I think about this, Marco, in probably three broad categories, right? Mindset, human mindset, technology, and regulation. Okay. I believe as Jay said, the technology is there, especially on slow speed, and I think there'll be an accelerated effort to continue to enhance the technology as things continue to evolve, okay? And that's least of my, I don't have a worry, but that's least of our challenges, okay? I think the technology is going to get there. I think the second one is regulation, right? That I believe is going to be, and that's sort of tied to mindset, but honestly also tied to politics, right? And as Marco, you are Italian, if I understand correctly, right? I think the European countries are more progressive from a mindset perspective, right? To accept autonomy in the real sense. And I understand Italy, as an example, is moving very rapidly to create and accept autonomy locally, right? And so I think from a mindset perspective, there are two other elements. If you look at our population, the younger generation, my speculative view is they will never buy cars, right? They will want shared mobility. And I believe COVID is actually going to accelerate that. I think there are views people have that COVID is going to hurt mobility as a service or shared mobility, which are two distinct things. My view is it will not. So the younger generation definitely will not be in the business of buying vehicles like I used to when I was 20 some years old, right? The older generation doesn't want to buy vehicles, right? For various reasons, right? So I think the mindset is going to move fast or faster. The biggest challenge and the opportunity we're going to have is around regulation, and that's going to vary, right? I think the developed parts of the world will move the slowest. The developing nations will move quicker. And my example I use is when I was growing up in India, getting a landline at home was, it took years to get a landline. Okay, everybody in India has 2 cell phones today. Not everybody, but literally, right? So the society moved from having no telephone connections to people accepting and using mobile sets for running their lives, for payment systems, right? So I think the regulation is going to move the slowest, but I think there will be a cliff event as the mindset evolves to force regulation to catch up, if I'm making sense, right? And I think it's going to happen across the board, whether it's slow speed mobility, which is our core, to high speed mobility as we progress. So that's kind of how I think about the 3 elements that I talked about, right? Technology, mindset, and regulation. And I think all 3 will come together to help us move forward.
So I want to close out with an extension of this theme where we were focused really on autonomous vehicles, but I want to talk about mobility generally over, let's say 20 years is what we typically ask our guests to look out. So you've got Ali, this shared autonomous electric vehicle. There are other pieces of the autonomous puzzle, AI-based traffic management or autonomous fleet management. But then we've got stuff like the pilotless drones, drone taxis, or we've got Elon Musk's Hyperloop and his so-called Boring Company. Do all of these take hold? Are they all commercial? Are these flights of fancy? How do people get around? How do goods get moved in 20 years? What does that look like?
Michael, I wish I could predict how goods will move in 20 years because I would be working on all of those things. The thing I will say, though, having said that, is they will not move the way we think they move. And I'll just use, the current. When was the last time a new mall was built in the United States of America? 2007, right? And COVID has accelerated people buying stuff from home. I, before COVID, never did groceries online. Guess what I do now? It's online. So I think there's going to be a shift in how goods move, how far they will have to move, right? Given the earlier discussion we had around localized supply chains, right? And the methodology. So how they move is basically, is it, more regional, more statewide, so on and so forth. Second is how far, right? Which is correlated to that. And third is how they will move will be not by a driver driving a Class 8 semi-truck, okay? It's going to be moving in different ways. And I do believe autonomy and EV and alternative fuels will be key part of that movement. Yeah, I'll let you add, please.
I think if you watched the latest X-Men movie, I'll bring it back to pop culture, and you for Wolverine was the movie. They had this very gritty version of automated highway, whereas normal highway, but the trucks that were on it, 90% of them were high-speed autonomous point-to-point carriers didn't, and they got in accidents, they did other things, but the bulk of transit there, whereas other humans still drove cars around. The future is messy and disorganized, just like the present, but these broad stroke trends really work. And so I think we're going to see autonomy in complicated first and last mile where people are distracted and a lot of accidents happen, but sensors can do a lot to be able to move things along. Simple examples I would give you would be like, today you tell an Uber, I'm coming downstairs, but you're really not. You're in an elevator in an office building or something, and you're 5 minutes away. That means that they're circling or standing on a curb illegally or other things like that. Sensors, Bluetooth beacons, and locations can easily solve that problem for an autonomous vehicle to link up with where you are and make that a less frictionful engagement. And so goods and people are going to move better because of technology in the future. And, if you have to take it from Wolverine, or you can take it from knowing that, where you are with your own devices and the things that work and the things that don't, as Vikrant has pointed out, online shopping is an example of where it started with your pizza tracker from Domino's. You could see where your pizza was, and now all your groceries. And so there's just more and more we're going to see in the near future. Referencing Elon Musk, I think it's been wonderful to watch SpaceX move things forward. Recently, we've seen the first in 10 years manned mission from private spaceflight to bring astronauts to the International Space Station. But maybe more exciting was reusable rockets that land back on a robotic ship. I believe I heard that Elon Musk was watching Vikrant Aggarwal talk about 3D printing a car while everyone else was watching his rockets land. But I don't know. That's just an apocryphal story that I've heard. But I think
another piece of science fiction.
Another piece of science fiction. It is, but he will need local motors, microfactories on Mars when he gets people up there, because we need to have resilient supply chains, and there's no place that needs to be more resilient than an extraterrestrial outpost that's trying to make work happen. So we are in an amazing time of change and disruption. And you can either be scared by it or you can embrace it and move along. Certainly at Local Motors, we're embracing it, and that makes it very exciting to be part of.
Perfect closing sentiment. All right. Thank you both very much. This has been a super interesting conversation, and appreciate your taking the time.
Indeed. Thanks, Vikrant. Thanks, Jay.
Michael, Marco, thank you very much. Have a good day.
Michael, Marco, Vikrant, thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks to the folks over at Podblade for editing this episode. Podblade is an affordable podcast editing service focused on making podcasting more accessible by offering all-in-one podcast editing, starting at just $20 per episode. We learned the hard way that audio editing is one of the most time-consuming parts of the podcasting process. That's why we are now using Podblade to edit our shows. Check them out at podblade.com. That's podblade.com. And tell them M4 Edge sent you.